watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on John Cassian. And John Cassian is a historical monk from the 5th century that we'll be looking at today. I'll be introducing you to him about his works, a brief biographical introduction, and I'm working on getting the PowerPoint over to the computer here, so you'll have to bear with me momentarily, but I want to look at, in particular, Cassian's view of grace and the role that grace plays with regard to salvation, and how much and what type of grace is needed for salvation, because he is commonly accused of being a so-called Semi-Pelagian. And so my intent and purpose today is to lead you to a conclusion where you can decide for yourself whether you think he is a Semi-Pelagian. And the lovely tech issues with the computer, I think I'm going to have to whip up a classic USB drive to swap over the PowerPoint to the right computer here. Let's see if I can pull this up. But I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you might have about John Cassian. And Gabe, if you're able to, could you pull up the chart from last week? We'll see if Gabe can get that up. I might have it here, actually. We'll whip up that chart from last week as we look at the Semi-Pelagians. And last week, I introduced you to this advanced chart. And this advanced chart really is my way of describing this spectrum of models of Ordo Salutis. And one of our viewers last week made an astute observation, and he commented on our YouTube channel that would Cassian's view here be in alignment with the Eastern Greek tradition, and that is the Eastern Church Fathers? Would they be seen as Semi-Pelagian according to the Reformed paradigm? And the answer to that question is yes. According to the Reformed paradigm, they would say that all the Eastern Fathers are Semi-Pelagian. Now, of course, this strikes me as extremely silly to label the Eastern Church Fathers as Semi-Pelagian. They never would agree with that, and likewise, Cassian comes from the East. So, let me bend out of frame here, and see, I got to pull a USB drive here. I apologize, as the program was not sending through our system. Let's see here. Got to find a USB stick that'll work. Alright, let's try this here. I think the PowerPoint for today is a little too large. So that should get us going. I see Amber's made it. Thanks for tuning in again, Amber. I'll work on getting this PowerPoint over. But one thing that I want to look at as well is the historical background to Cassian. And we can learn about Cassian himself from even the writings of his opponents, which makes for a particularly interesting study, because you can't always do that when you look at church history. And it's when we see the writings of Prosper of Aquitaine that we can learn more about him. So, here we go. I'll just drop this over here, and hopefully this will work. And we're almost there. All right, let's see here. So that's the advanced chart of theological models that I made. And we will be reviewing this again at the end to see if Cassian fits as a Semi-Pelagian. Now, you'll recall that last week I defined and described what is commonly called Semi-Pelagianism, the idea that man or humans could take the first step in salvation devoid of divine grace, apart from divine grace. So that's the metric, and that's the formal metric we'll use. When I say formal, I mean that is the dictionary definition, that is the encyclopedic definition of semi-Pelagianism. So we're going to use the formal definitions. We're not going to change the definitions. I was engaging with someone on Twitter a couple weeks back. He wanted to change the definition and add to it terms that were not there. And so we don't want to allow that. So Gabe will go off screen here and open up the proper PowerPoint. There we go. We had to do the classic USB transfer. Sometimes the web doesn't always cooperate nicely. So here we are. This is an introduction to John Cassian. We could call this PowerPoint, was John Cassian a semi-Pelagian? But we're also introducing you to him because, let's be honest, not a lot of people have read the primary sources. In fact, here is the earliest English translation of Cassian's work. You might recognize it from Philip Schaff's series on the Church Fathers. And it's the translation was by a fellow named Gibson in the late 1800s. So Cassian's writings had not been translated into English until the late 1800s. So a lot of people didn't know about Cassian even as they studied theology. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, here's our chart. And I will be arguing that Cassian fits with the Gallic monk category. Now, he was of Eastern origin, and so we'll jump into that. So there are three semi-Pelagians. Today we'll be looking at John Cassian. Next week we'll be looking at Vincent of Lorenz. So, biographical details. Now we are rolling. Cassian was born around AD 360 in Scythia Minor, or today what might be called Dobroja. And it's a region shared by modern-day Romania and Bulgaria. And I have this little map there. It's that dark green area. That is Dobroja. We don't know exactly what town he hails from. We just know the region. We know it's Scythia Minor. There are some scholars who question that, but there's a general consensus by the historical theologians that he's from Scythia Minor. Now, he became a student. He was well educated as a young child, and in his later childhood years and young adult years, he became a student of monasticism and spent 7 years in Bethlehem. And he traveled there with his friend Germanus. And they spent some time there, several years, but they wanted to go deeper into studying monasticism and pursuing the beatific vision, right? What does it mean to be in the presence of God, to have immediate knowledge of God? So they traveled, John and Germanus traveled to Egypt, and they spent some 20 years there. They traveled, it was 2 trips basically, but roughly 20 years total, and they studied under Evagrius Ponticus, who was an Egyptian desert father. So he had a lot of this wisdom of what it means to pursue God and to study God, not just analytically, but the sanctification of our flesh itself, and dealing with the 8 principal vices, which would later become translated in the West to the 7 deadly sins. So around 400, they leave Egypt and they head north. This is likely due to concerns over their own safety regarding the Origenist controversy. That, while intriguing, is not as much my interest. My interest is more in the time that he spent in Roman Gaul and his writings therein. So, around the year 400, they leave and head north. And next, we see that they sit under the teachings of John Chrysostom. And Cassian is ordained into the diaconate no later than AD 407. Now, we don't know the precise year. We know in his writings, Cassian talks about being ordained into the diaconate by John Chrysostom, whom he speaks highly of. What's relevant here, though, is Cassian has spent 27 some years studying monasticism. studying what it means to follow Jesus and to pursue the knowledge, the intimate, immediate knowledge of God. And now, finally, formally, he is perhaps 40 years old. He retains a formal position in the church as a deacon. Okay? Now, we've got this nice little chart. I snagged it from online. Someone has done a nice job for me drawing out a map here. So you see, you can follow the blue. The blue goes from his early life down to Bethlehem. The green from Bethlehem to Egypt. And then the red on up to Constantinople and then over to Roman Gaul. We'll get there momentarily. I do want to make one little note here about the blue line. I'm not persuaded that the person who made the blue line, it looks like that line goes a little too far west, further into Romania, beyond what Scythia Minor would have been. It was more a narrow strip. If we go back, you see the green there. I think that blue line just goes a little too far if you compare the dark green section to the start of the blue line. So I would have it go a little more north. But again, we don't know the exact town where Cassian hails from. Okay, now while he is in Constantinople studying under John Chrysostom, and we know that this is no later than 407 because that's when Chrysostom dies. So it must have occurred presumably a couple years before then. So we know sometime between 400, perhaps 399 and 407. So you have this 6 to 8 year window here. He is sent to Rome to deliver a letter. And he would meet and perhaps become friends with Leo, who would later become Pope. Then, during his time in Rome, we lose track of him. We don't know if he stays in Rome for some 10 years. We don't know if he goes back to Constantinople and then returns west. What we do know is that in the mid to late 410s, so think 414, 416, 418 maybe, he reappears on the map. And we see him now in Roman Gaul, modern-day France. And he has founded 2 monasteries in Marseille, one for women and one for men. And he does so to provide organization for an immature Gallic monasticism. And it was immature because it was like a free-for-all. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. A lot of people didn't know what they were doing. They were disorganized. Monks were sleeping at various times of days. You had a subordinate monk explicitly reject the instruction of his superior. It was very disorderly. And so Cassian was tasked with bringing order to this Western movement. He was experienced, like I said, 27 years studying monasticism, living in monastic communities. And so he was tasked with writing a work called The Institutes. And so he has 3 works that survive to us. The Institutes was this first work that we know. And it's a basic how-to on monasticism. And this how-to described the very basics of what orderly communal monasticism looked like. And this includes something as basic as what a monk should wear. What should they eat? How should their day be structured? And the Institutes is composed of 12 books, if I'm going off my memory here. And the first 4 books were on those sort of day-to-day operations in order to bring order and cohesion to communal monasticism. The final 8 books were on dealing with the 8 principal vices. How should monks deal with these sins, the deadly sins? And these sins find commonality in the Egyptian desert fathers. So we know not only from biographical details, but from comparing content, that Cassian is a student of Eastern monasticism, of the Eastern Greek theological tradition. And we find that he is sent to the West to train and bring order, to carry those values, those theological values, the theological teachings he was trained with, into the West. Now that's very important, and it's very important to recognize that as we begin to look at his doctrine of grace, his doctrine of humanity, his doctrine of sin, because those doctrines will carry over from the Eastern Greek theological tradition into the Latin West. And it's going to find itself in conflict with the North African theology and the North African theology of Augustine. So there will become a conflict. But we'll get to that in a little bit. His second work is called Conferences. I'm giving the English terms, I'm giving the shortened titles here. The Latin titles are longer. Just keeping it nice and simple today. Conferences. So the Conferences are a collection of the teachings of the Egyptian Desert Fathers. It's far more, it's deeper, it's far more comprehensive than the Institutes. The Institutes deal with, the 8 principal vices, but the Conferences, is far fuller. It's a much longer work, bigger work, and it goes deeper into various doctrines and teachings. Now, to be clear, these teachings of the Egyptian Desert Fathers were not to be understood in Cassian's work here to be rigidly historical. The way that the work is laid out, it's very dialectical. It's John and Germanus asking questions of the Desert Fathers, and the Desert Fathers give their answers. This is not, again, a historical record. This is rather John's adaptation of their teaching into his new context. And we have some reason for believing this, because we might obviously have questions of how well John could remember verbatim words of the Desert Fathers, but also that some of the answers that the Egyptian Desert Fathers give don't compute to modern-day France or Roman Gaul. That the answers that are given do compute to that context, but would not fit with the Egyptian context. So that's how we know that John has sort of adapted these teachings, which are nonetheless faithful, reliable teachings of the Desert Fathers, but we know that they've been adapted into the West. All right, on the Incarnation. This is the only Western work written against Nestorius, and it was his old friend, Leo, who had now become Pope, who asked him to write a work against Nestorianism prior to Nestorius' formal condemnation. Now, Nestorianism is a Christological heresy, so that means it's about the person of Christ. And what made it heretical was that Nestorius argued that there were two people. There was the person, the Jesus of Nazareth, he was human, and then there was the pre-incarnate divine Logos. And they were two people in one composite. So this was deemed and ruled heretical. Cassian writes the only Latin work against him. And this is particularly interesting to us for our pursuit of seeing if Cassian was a Semi-Pelagian. Because in this work, not only is it different from the Institutes and the Conferences, in that it is a formal theological treatise. So we have a proper theological treatise from Cassian, but also that Cassian is the first Christian thinker to associate and affiliate Nestorianism with the heresy of Pelagianism. That's one reason why it's particularly interesting to see what Cassian thinks about Pelagianism and to see if he himself would be considered a Semi-Pelagian. So, now, after giving this brief biographical sketch, and looking at his works, I want to jump in a little further into the content of Cassian's writings. We're going to look at some select passages of his, and we'll look at Prosper of Aquitaine, and I'll reiterate or repeat some of the passages I mentioned last week from Augustine's On the Predestination of the Saints. And we're going to look at all of this to see whether Cassian himself should be considered a Semi-Pelagian. So, first I want to start with the theological treatise on the Incarnation. So, he wrote 7 books within this work. Sometimes books today we might consider chapters. This is, just the way of creating an organized system. And, it's all relative. What we call a chapter today might be considered a book back then, in terms of the effort and the length at writing and how many pages would qualify as a book. Is 30 pages a book? Is 30 pages a chapter? Right? To us, it's a chapter in the modern world. So I have 2 passages in particular. Now, there are others, but I've selected 2 to share with you today from Cassian's On the Incarnation of Christ against Nestorius. Cassian affiliates this error of Nestorianism with the heresy of Pelagianism. And he says here that this error sprang from the error of Pelagius, that in saying that Jesus Christ had lived as a mere man without any stain of sin, they actually went so far as to declare that men could also be without sin if they liked. Let me pause here. So what Cassian's doing is he's saying the error of Pelagius here is that each man could, in theory, live without sin, without the stain of sin, just like Jesus Christ. Let's continue. For they imagined that it followed that if Jesus Christ, being a mere man, was without sin, all men could also, without the help of God, be whatever he, as a mere man, without participating in the Godhead, could, without the help of God, be whatever he, as a mere man, without participating in the Godhead, could be. Okay? It's a little repetitious there. But the point that Cassian's making is that for Pelagianism, each human, we could live as if without the stain of sin, because humanity, that we inherit the consequences of Adam's sin. Now, I know there are others out there on the web who would even contest the myth of Pelagianism. I'm not here doing that today. I'm simply focusing on Semi-Pelagianism. So I want to set that debate aside and simply deal with Semi-Pelagianism. Okay? So for the sake of discussion, we're going to assume that there was this thing called Pelagianism. We can assume that Pelagius distanced himself from that, but that there were some of his followers, like Celestius and Julian, who nevertheless defended full-on Pelagianism. So this is the same error as Nestorius, because now you have a mere man. With Nestorius, you've got 2 persons, and now you have a mere man who is without sin. So you see that connection now? He makes that connection, and he's the first to do so. He draws that connection in a few other places. Let's look at one more place. This is in Book 6 of On the Incarnation. If Christ, who was born of Mary, is not the same person as he who is of God, you, that is Nestorius, certainly make 2 Christs, after the manner of that abominable error of Pelagius, which in asserting that a mere man was born of the Virgin, said that he was the teacher rather than the redeemer of mankind. For he did not bring to men redemption of life, but only an example of how to live. Again, you see the connection here? If Pelagianism were true, then the atoning work of Christ is not necessary for the salvation of humans. Some humans could earn their salvation. Likewise, you have with Nestorius this idea of another Christ who is fully human and has no sin, just like what Pelagius would have said as a logical entailment of Pelagianism. So Cassian draws this tight connection between these two heresies. Okay, for our purposes, we see that Cassian is not a Pelagian. He rejects it in multiple cases in this work, and explicitly so. We also see in his conferences that he rejects Pelagianism, but not in such explicit terms. So, why would one think that he is a Pelagian or a semi-Pelagian? Well, let's talk about what I call the Augustinian contention. Now, the Augustinian contention is a way of describing why Cassian found himself in conflict with North African theology. So, first, I want to talk about Prosper of Aquitaine's letter to Augustine. Prosper of Aquitaine was a follower of Augustine. Augustine lives North Africa. Prosper is, part of this broader Gallic region. Aquitaine is one smaller region therein. And in his second letter to Augustine, the first is extant. It's dated to roughly 428 or 429. We learn what Prosper's purpose is for writing to Augustine, and it was to receive help from a, quote, special protector of the faith against those matters that I understand to be extremely dangerous, end quote. And what are these matters? Well, Prosper writes in the second section that there are these monks who, quote, dwell in the city of Marseille, and they think that whatever you discuss concerning the calling of the elect, according to God's plan, is opposed to the opinion of the fathers and to the mind of the church, end quote. I'm going to pull up the work here, and I'll read directly from the book. This is the Works of St. Augustine, a translation for the 21st century. Answer to the Pelagians, number 4. Okay, and here you can see and read for yourself a translation of Prosper's letter to Augustine. So that's why he's writing to him. And he's talking about the monks of Marseille. Now remember, it doesn't take a rocket scientist here. Cassian founded 2 monasteries in Marseille in the mid to late 410s. And this is 12 years later, maybe 10 years later, that Prosper is writing to Augustine. And he does so because we see here that Cassian is in conflict with North African theology. Now, we also know from another one of Prosper's works that it's Cassian, because the work written by Prosper, using Augustinian sources, is called Against the Conferencer. So we know that these two guys, now Prosper being a layman, to start during the season of his life, a layman, they're in conflict. So we've got some challenges here. But it's from Prosper's letter that we can learn more about these monks and what they believed. And in our pursuit of seeing if they were semi-Pelagian, we're going to look at Prosper's letter here. Now, this is what he writes to Augustine in the 3rd section of his letter. For the following is what they state and profess. Every human being certainly sinned when Adam sinned, and no one can be saved by his own works, but only by rebirth through the grace of God. All human beings, without exception, have, nonetheless, been offered the reconciliation which is present in the mystery of the blood of Christ, so that whoever chooses to come to the faith and to baptism can be saved. God, however, foreknew, prior to the creation of the world, those who are going to believe and who are going to continue in that faith, which after its reception needs the help of grace. And he predestined for his kingdom those whom he foresaw would, after having been gratuitously called, be worthy of election and would leave this life by a good death. And therefore every human being is admonished by the teaching of God to believe and to act in order that no one may despair of attaining eternal life, since a reward has been prepared for a person's willing devotion. So that's a brief description from Prosper himself. Now, here we see a few things about original sin, their views of election, for example, and it's to this section that Augustine gives a reply in the Predestination of the Saints. But before we get to that, I do want to share one more section from Prosper, his fourth section in his letter, because Prosper associates the Gallic monks with Pelagianism. Not semi-Pelagian, not half-Pelagian, but Pelagianism. That term, semi-Pelagian, doesn't appear in Prosper's writings. It doesn't appear in Augustine's writings. It doesn't even appear in the Second Council of Orange in the 6th century. It appears 1,000 years later. The way that Prosper associates Cassian with Pelagianism is this. In the 4th section, he writes, "Certain of them, however, do not wander very far from the paths of the Pelagians, for when they are forced to acknowledge the grace of Christ, which anticipates all human merits. Otherwise, if it is repayment for merits, it is called grace to no point at all. They want this grace to pertain to the creation of every human being. By their creation, the grace of the Creator has established each of them with free choice and rationality, but without any prior merits, since none of them previously existed." Prosper describes here this idea of a natural ability of each human from God's creative act. So, is that a fair description of Cassian? I would say yes. Does that make Cassian a semi-Pelagian? Not necessarily. So let's continue on. One thing that the translator and editor of this work observes, Roland Teskey, he says, "The monks of Provence, then, clearly differed from Augustine, not merely on the beginning of faith, but on their understanding of predestination, on the efficacy of the grace of Christ, on the determinativeness of the number of the predestined, and the universality of God's salvific will." So you'll see here, if we were to use contemporary terms, that the Gallic monks, according to Prosper himself, who's one of their opponents, their view of election would have been far closer to that of what we might today call the classical Arminian position. All right, so let's look at the Augustinian contention, Cassian's Conference 13. And in Cassian's writings, we have a few questionable statements. Now, Conference 13 is the conference with the most about the providence of God and about the grace of God. It has the most select passages about that. It's about God's providence in the course of human life. There are other statements about divine grace in many of the other conferences, and I've done some of the work, and we will review some of those. But it's Conference 13 that has a few questionable statements. And this is what leads, these questionable statements are what lead Prosper to make the accusations that he does in his letter and in his work against the conferencer. So let's look at two passages here. The first one comes from chapter 9. It's on the slide here. This is again John Cassian. "But that it may be still clearer that through the excellence of nature, which is granted by the goodness of the Creator, sometimes the first beginnings of a good will arise, which, however, cannot attain to the complete performance of what is good unless it is guided by the Lord." Uh-oh, red flag. This is semi-Pelagianism, right? There you go. Excellence of nature. Yeah, it's granted by the goodness of Creator, but the beginnings come from the human, and then God's grace comes later, right? Boy, we've got him pinned. He's a semi-Pelagian. Another passage in chapter 8 of Conference 13 says this: "And when he sees in us some beginning of a good will, he at once enlightens it and strengthens it and urges it on towards salvation increasing that which he himself implanted, or which he sees to have arisen from our own efforts. Okay, we caught him again, but that passage is a mixed bag, because Cassian says, increasing that which he himself implanted, or which he sees to have arisen from our own efforts. So wait a second. Not all men can take the first step and then grace comes later, because some, God has implanted this goodness. So these are questionable statements, and there are a couple others. When we read Prosper's Against the Conferencer, we see how Prosper has lifted these passages out of context. Because I'm just giving you a sentence here and a sentence there from two different chapters. I'm not even giving you the broader context. Or, and more importantly, the fuller doctrine of grace in Cassian's writings. These questionable statements must be interpreted in light of Cassian's overall doctrine of grace. And Cassian's doctrine of grace is that grace is concurrent with human freedom. It is necessary. God's grace is necessary for every good act, and it's varied or variegated. It's sometimes given in greater quantities and in greater qualities, depending upon the circumstances. So when we look at Cassian's other select passages, which we will do so momentarily, we see that his passages about the freedom of the will's act must also be understood in light of his doctrine of grace. So let's consider a few select passages. I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 passages, just 6. There are many more. There are tens of statements, probably not 100, but there are tens of statements about how God's grace functions in relation to human freedom. So I'll just read 6 for you today as we think about whether Cassian was a Semi-Pelagian. We have those questionable statements in Conference 13. And here, let's go through these passages from the conferences. These are not exclusively from Conference 13. There's one from Institute's Book 12 and Conference 3. These first few come from Conference 13. These things are mixed together and fused so indistinguishably that which is dependent on which is a great question, so far as many people are concerned. That is, whether God has mercy on us because we manifest the beginnings of a good will, or we acquire the beginnings of a good will because God is merciful. He says that these are fused so indistinguishably. We can't figure it out. Okay? We can't. There's no way of knowing even. Conference 13, chapter 16. But no one should think that we have suggested these things in an attempt to say that the whole of salvation is entirely dependent on our faith, according to the godless opinion of some, who ascribe everything to free will, Pelagianism, and understand that the grace of God is dispensed to each person in conformity with his deserts. However, we declare firmly and clearly that the grace of God sometimes even overflows and surpasses the limits of human faithfulness. Institute's Book 12, chapter 14. For in saying that human effort by itself cannot seize it, apart from God's help, we thus assert that God's mercy and grace are bestowed only on those who toil and labor, and that it is indeed given to those who ask, opened to those who knock, and found by those who seek. But not that our asking, searching, and knocking are sufficient, unless God's mercy gives what we ask, opens when we knock, and, here we go, causes to be found what we are seeking. So God causes to be found what we are seeking. For he is ready so long as we have offered him our good will. There's clearly a synergistic relationship between grace and freedom of the will. That's that's not the point of contention. Now, some people are going to reject that as a feasible model. You're welcome to affirm monergism. That's fine. My interest here is to look at this historically. I'm not asking people to evaluate or reevaluate their interpretations of Paul in the New Testament. I'm just simply asking a historical question about the Gallic monks here. Continuing on. For it behooves us to believe not only that we cannot possess this perfection by our own toil and effort, but that we cannot even bring into play those very things that we use for this end, namely our effort, our exertion, and our labor, without the help of God's protection and his inspiration, and without the grace of correction and encouragement which he is accustomed to pour mercifully into our hearts, either through another or by himself when he visits us. So you see here, the grace of God is required. It's necessary for salvation. We've got two more here. For it must be admitted that everything occurs either by his will or by his permission. We should believe that good things are accomplished by the will of God and by his help, while unfavorable things are accomplished by his permission, when on account of our wickedness and hardness of heart, the divine protection abandons us and allows the devil or the shameful passions of the body to master us. Everything good that happens is because of the grace of God. That includes human free will choices. Back to Conference 13 here. And so the manifold wisdom of God dispenses the salvation of human beings by numerous and inscrutable kindness and imparts its generous grace according to the capacity of each person, so that he wills to administer healing, not according to the uniform power of his majesty, but according to the degree of faith that he finds in each person, or that he himself has bestowed on each person. So you see here that grace is varied, and it depends on the person. I want to read one more passage here from the end of Conference 13 as a conclusion summary of sorts from Cassian on the protection of God. For the God of all must be held to work in all, so as to not incite, protect, and strengthen, but not to take away the freedom of the will which he himself has once given. So the freedom of the will is given by God. If, however, any more subtle inference of man's argumentation and reasoning seems opposed to this interpretation, it should be avoided rather than brought forward to the destruction of the faith. He continues on, for how God works all things in us, and yet everything can be ascribed to free will, cannot be fully grasped by the mind and reason of man. You have this inscrutable truth that it is both the grace of God and the free will of man that work together cooperatively, and we just don't know the order. And there is no way to know the order. The whole point is this. When we look at this definition and description of Semi-Pelagianism, we see Cassian's writings as a whole do not fit with that definition. So let's go back to this chart, the advanced chart as I called it. It wasn't a basic chart. It wasn't a less basic or even less basic chart. As I wrote last week, I created and evolved the chart, starting out with a very simple, what's so common way of describing these debates, when really the truth is muddier than that. And so we need to clarify these complex issues. So this is my attempt to clarify this issue. And you can look here about the separation of nature and grace. This is what the Augustinians and the Pelagians do. And this is what the Calvinists and the Arminians do. But Cassian and others before him, like John Chrysostom, do not separate nature and grace, but rather are concurrent and work closely, indistinguishably together. All right, we've got a question from Amber here. So the label of Semi-Pelagian actually heresy, depending on the technicality? Amber, that's a little, the grammar there's a little iffy for me as I'm reading this here. So Semi-Pelagianism is not legally, formally, I should say, a heresy anywhere. It's not, that label did not exist at the Second Council of Orange. So as much as you might hear Reformed systematic theologians saying Semi-Pelagianism was rejected at the Second Council of Orange, I contest that they are wrong. And I've read the primary sources. I've argued in my dissertation that when you look at the canons and definitions of this, they are simply creating a recondemnation of Pelagianism, that it is not Semi-Pelagianism. In fact, where are these Semi-Pelagians? When you have councils condemning heretics, they are mentioned by name over and over. Ecumenical councils and regional synods. These heretics are mentioned by name. The Second Council of Orange makes no mention of Cassian, Vincent, or Faustus. Those are all 5th century monks. The Second Council of Orange occurring in the first half of the 6th century. No problem being on your phone. I appreciate you watching on your phone, Amber. Thanks for tuning in to our program here today, looking at John Cassian. So when we look at this chart, this advanced chart, we would place Cassian on this line, on the spectrum of concurrence of nature and grace. It's not really even a spectrum, it's a point. And it's a point, I'll explain why in a couple weeks when we get to Faustus and we talk about the royal way, or the middle path, and that to fall off on one side is to commit an error on either side. That's why I've got this point here, and I have the slopes going down. We'll get more into that in a couple weeks. So let's review. Was John Cassian a Semi-Pelagian? Number one, when we look at Prosper's letter, we see that he describes how the Gallic monks, these monks from Marseille, believe in the grace of God and its universality and its necessity. Now, again, it's a different view of grace than the Augustinian North African theological model. But the way Prosper describes it, we can see that God's grace is incorporated at all stages. When we look at Augustine's predestination of the saints, which I did last week, and I'll read a couple passages here again, we can see that he does not consider them Pelagian, and he calls them brothers. And those brethren of ours on whose behalf your pious love is solicitous have attained with Christ's church to the belief that the human race is born obnoxious to the sin of the first man, and that none can be delivered from that evil save by the righteousness of the second man. Here's the key sentence. Moreover, they have attained to the confession that men's wills are anticipated by God's grace, and to the agreement that no one can suffice to himself, either for beginning or for completing any good work. That descriptive line is in direct conflict with the definition of Semi-Pelagianism. So from number 2, Augustine's predestination of the saints, we see here that Cassian would not be considered Semi-Pelagian. When we look at Cassian's on the incarnation against Nestorius, we see that Cassian would have nothing to do with this heretic Pelagius, and he describes why that is, and he, in part because Cassian affirms the effects of the fall affected Adam's posterity. So we can see here that he separates himself from Pelagianism. He never would have been affiliated with Pelagianism, and that he holds to a different view of grace. Finally, Cassian's conferences. We see that while there are few questionable statements from Cassian, it's only when they are lifted out of context, without regard for their context or Cassian's overall doctrine of grace, that we would misunderstand him to be saying anything close to something like Semi-Pelagianism. Again, even with some of those questionable statements, it's already a mixed bag, because he talks about how God's grace is already there and needed from the get-go. It's needed for everything, every good act. So from these 4 sources, we find evidence, and I haven't even shared 20% of it. And so I want to encourage people to read the primary sources, read Conference 13, all of it, read all of the conferences, because there's a lot more data that's out there that Cassian has written. And ask yourself, does this sound like something a Semi-Pelagian would say? And the answer to that is no. John Cassian was not a Semi-Pelagian. So that's my quick case. That's my 45-minute case for why John Cassian was not a Semi-Pelagian. Now, there's a lot more to be said here. There are nuances and doctrinal beliefs that we really should explore. Cassian was a 5th century monk. He was not a 21st century Protestant. So the way that he understood salvation, and even more specifically justification, would very likely be different from the way 21st century Protestants or 16th century Protestants would think of it. Nevertheless, if we are to pursue understanding Cassian's theological anthropology, his doctrine of man, we need to be fair in understanding his teachings to see what he believed about the fall of mankind, about original sin, about whether man had free will, and if so, how is it grounded, how does it work, and what his doctrine of grace was. So when we do that, we can see that he was not a Semi-Pelagian. I'm not asking you to agree with Cassian. I myself have some disagreements with him here and there, but I want to correct the historical record. That would be my one goal, my one achievement in my academic pursuits. It would be to correct the historical record on this issue. That would be a deep joy to me over the course of my career. So here we are. We're starting at it. I've been going at it for a few years now, but this is a short little 45-minute case for why Cassian was not a Semi-Pelagian. All right, next week we're going to look at a monk that followed shortly after Cassian. We are going to look at Vincent of Lérins, his writings, and some exciting discoveries. So one of Vincent's works was lost to history but rediscovered in the 1930s. So that's sort of exciting. I'll talk about his works like I did with Cassian. You'll receive a biographical introduction. I'll talk about his works, and then we'll jump into some select passages looking at the issues at play with Vincent. If you've liked this episode today, I'd love your feedback on our YouTube videos. Write some comments. If you despised it, if you've got questions, ask away. I'd be happy to entertain those questions. This subject of the Gallic monks is a passion project of mine, and so I want to thank you for watching our episode today. I also want to thank our patrons. Those are folks that chip in a few bucks each month, and this ministry, Veracity Hill, is supported by generous givers, and we really would appreciate your partnership to develop more theological resources, to clarify complex issues in theology and apologetics. It's looking at both theological issues, but as people who subscribe to my YouTube channel know, we've done some videos on divine hiddenness, on Bart Ehrman, and the like. So it's a ministry geared towards equipping Christians to understand the Christian faith, the Christian tradition, to grow in their faith, but also to reach non-believers, if only to have a better understanding of the Christian worldview. But ultimately, I hope that if you're a non-believer, you'll consider the reasons for the Christian faith and pledge your allegiance to Jesus Christ the King. Amber's wondering if we'll make the PowerPoints available so we can study them more. Amber, I'll probably wait a few weeks and then post them all together. That way people can have all 4 of the PowerPoints. Last week's introduction, this week's on John Cassian, and I'll whip up another on Vincent, and finally Faustus. So we've got a little short series here on the Gallic monks and Semi-Pelagianism. So yes, I want to thank the viewers, and I want to thank the supporters for our program and the sponsorships that we have with Defenders Media and Apologetics 315 and Rethinking Hell. And Amber, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate your support for the ministry here. Thank you so much. So last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on John Cassian.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.